We had a chant when the earth pressed us. We had a chant when the earth pressed against us too in the long winter. We had pickled our stories in brittle jars of forgotten prayers and hung the hangul on our cracked walls. Our songs overlooked the apples of others and broke the barricades. We had our secrets when the moon rose from the glass mountains of stale shame. Our names lay safe in the shadows, banded quick with omens of our prisons. We felt the keys in our pockets and felt assured. We felt the keys in our pockets and felt reassured. The hooves of the galloping flood will only iron the heads of our apple trees when the moon was crucified. We forgot the dark and the scent of rain falling over culled saffron. We forgot the dark and the scent of rain falling over culled saffron. In your custom of prisons, we made by with the rumor of the wind and the sigh of flutes in lost spring. We set ablaze the bloom of orchards in our hearts when summer tore its feet on the shards of nights littered on the roads to our home. We set ablaze the bloom of orchards in our hearts when summer tore its feet on the shards of night littered on the roads to our home. We ran after the echoes of our dreams, hoping to find the sun there. Nothing was left for us except our gaze. Nothing was left for us except rest our gaze on the tired wrinkles of dawn. Let's go now, as we were. Let's go now, as we were, shadows conferred upon contrived metaphors.
Welcome, Huzaifa Pandit. We're really excited to have you at SAAG, and I'm just going to share a little bio for our viewers first. So it looks like you are the author of Green is the Color of Memory, published in 2018. And it won the first edition of Rhythm Divine Poets Chapbook Contest of 2017. You're also the winner of several poetry contests like Glass House Poetry Competition and Bound Poetry Contest. You were born and raised in Kashmir, right? Where in Kashmir were you born?
Chunara.
His poems alternate between despair, defiance, resistance, and compliance as they seek to make sense of a world where his identity is outlawed. His inspirations in poetry can be guessed from the topic of his PhD. Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Agha Shahid Ali, and Mahmoud Darwish. Poetics of Resistance, pursued at University of Kashmir. His poems, translations, interviews, essays, and papers have been published in various journals like Indian Literature, Paper Cuts, Life and Legends, Kashmir Lit, JLA India, Punch, and Noble Gas Quarterly. But you've also been writing for Kashmir Observer, right? And yes. You are the editor of Kashmir Lit.
True.
Tell me a little bit about being an editor at Kashmir Lit.
Yeah. So basically what my job is to first curate submissions, the submissions that we receive, poetry submissions. So first my job is to go through those and see which ones we are accepting and which ones we are not. In addition to that, I also have to reach out to people. All right, I reach out to people to send their poems. I commission people. Besides, one more thing I do is that we decide, Athar and I. It's usually done in consultation because Athar Zia, who teaches in US, all right, she's the chief editor. She founded the journal. CD stands for Apology. So with her, it's my idea, and I usually go by her, and she usually gets it. I select the theme. If there's a theme, for example, if we are publishing a special issue on Dalit literature or the lost literature last year that we had post 2000, post August 2019, or a special issue of resistance literature. All right. So my job is to not only select the theme, but also then to curate and write the editorial to set the tone for the uh, reader to, look at the context in which the poems must be read. That's basically a nutshell of what I do. In addition, I sometimes also curate, look for book reviews or essays. Usually, I don't do a lot of prose, but sometimes I do take a look at prose too.
Okay.
But my main aim is the aim is mainly to make Kashmir Lit more diverse, not just restricted to Kashmir, but get more voices which are radical, all right, which are dissenting voices to write in the journal.
Have you come across any books that you would recommend?
Yes, there's this book that's recently come. It's by my friend. I'm going to write a review on this. It's a novel, The Plague Upon Us. There is also a book called Shahnaz Bashir, an author called Shahnaz Bashir. His collection of short stories called Scattered Souls. And there is a poet called Asya Zuhur from Kashmir. She has written a book of poems called Serpents Under My Veil. I think these are three important books that have come out in the last year, 2 years, 2, 3 years out of Kashmir, and which and then there was this Night of the Broken Glass by Feroz Rathar. It's a novel and again a wonderful novel. Kashmir is producing actually a lot of literature. It's a good thing.
Do you think that all this production is purely resistance literature?
I won't say all of it is resistance literature. Uh, Most of it intends to be resistance literature. Whether it is resistance literature is a question that needs to be settled, that needs to be argued over. Because, in my opinion, everything that intends to be resistance literature does not end up being resistance literature. It tends to end up being polemical literature. All right. Uh, but yes, um, uh, resistance and dissent enjoy a monopoly over the Kashmiri imagination, Kashmiri writers' imagination. So yes, even if all of the literature is not, or most of the literature is not resistance literature, it at least intends itself to be resistance literature.
Right, and in some of your other columns, there's a theme of identity, of Kashmiris losing their identity, languages, the official languages changing from Urdu to, or not changing, but expanding to bring in other languages. Has that officially happened, and how has it affected you personally?
It has officially happened.
Mm-hmm.
It has happened. They have introduced a law, and uh, the law will be passed. I think it
It
will
will
be
be.
passed. Yeah. So it's a mere formality. It was there in the Reorganization Act itself.
Right.
Has it affected me personally? Well, it's yet to happen. So it can't have affected me
Mm-hmm.
personally. But what it will do is these things do not have an immediate effect. These are decisions which take, time to show the real damage that they have done. As I said in the a column, Urdu itself holds a very important place in the Kashmiri literary imaginaries,
Right.
right? Because it is one not only the language of dissent, it is also the state language in which dissent was originally articulated. Now English is fast gaining prominence. That's a separate question, but originally it has been Urdu that has been used to keep the sentiment of dissent alive.
Right.
So by quashing Urdu, they are attempting to silence the voices of dissent. And B, Urdu is our link with the Indian Muslim. It's supposed to be a quote unquote a Muslim language.
Right.
So by introducing other languages, what they are trying to signal is that it's time for a permanent demographic change. Because by abolishing Urdu, they are removing its historical significance. As I said, Hurriyat speaks in Urdu. The person who is talking to the army guy, you express your resistance to the state basically in Urdu. The lowest instrument of state, that is the soldier. To the soldier, you talk in Urdu. So by taking away that, you are gradually pushing for the extinction of a language. And by pushing for the extinction of a language, you're pushing for extinction of the history and the sentiments associated with that history. Because life, the present is a function of the past. All right. So by altering that past, they're hoping to alter the present altogether beyond recognition. So it's what has been done successfully by Israel, by other countries, which have had practiced settler colonialism. It's another facet, small step towards that. So yes, in the long run, it will affect me too.
I saw that you wrote about feminism as well.
Yeah, I have. It's the Orientalism and patriarchy in Alif Shafak's 40 Rules of Love.
Let's start with that.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit about that. How you came to.
Well, actually, there was this friend of mine who was praising the book To the Skies that Alif Shafak has written about Islamic feminism and Islamic this and Sufism this and Sufism that. Now, since I have happened to have studied literature, we happen to have read a little bit of Sufism too. And we know by experience that Sufism is not what Alif Shafak pretends it to be. All right. So one was that thing. All right. Sufism is much more detailed and much more complex than mere feel-good, stories that she makes as truisms that she gives as the rules. But okay, that would have been fine too. My primary problem with the book was that it served the post-colonial bazaar that has sprung up. It is the colonial guilt that is being packaged and sold back in the name of desiness to the exotic, to the audience out in the West. All right, and it's usually someone from the East who is doing it. All right, who is selling their wares. So you have, for example, Khalid Husseini, the same problem. Kite Runner, which is typically the Orientalist book. Whatever be the, I'm not a great fan of the Taliban, but to suggest that Afghanistan was a haven before Taliban came is completely doing a disservice to the history of Afghanistan. And it's just selling to the American mind the idea of the Taliban as demons. When I read the book, I found that it had a deeply problematic part. For example, the woman who is supposed to be the narrator, all right, who is supposed to be the writer of the book, she is trapped in a lonely marriage. And who can rescue her from a lonely marriage? It's ultimately a man who rescues her from the lonely marriage and who helps her discover her quest for truth. All right. So one is it's merely reiterating and re-establishing the supremacy of the man. The woman doesn't have enough agency on her own to take a decision. Then when you take the love story of Rumi and Rumi, not the love story, but the French story of friendship. Some call it a love story, a quest story between Shams and Rumi. All right, fine. But look at the descriptions of Shams. All right, Shams is presented as this ascetic soul who is immediately contrasted with traditional religion. And traditional religion is stereotypically described, clad, for example, in a scene between a cleric and Shams. All right, look at the framing of the scene. The cleric is dressed in heavy fur, He has rings on his fingers. He has heavy jewelry, and he is a glutton. He's eating, quite a lot. In contrast, Shams is lean, thin, and of ascetic temperament. Where is the reader supposed to go? The reader is naturally bound to sympathize with the character of Shams.
Right,
All
right.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So it is basically saying that traditional religion itself is wrong. That traditional Islam, quote unquote, which is not Sufi Islam, is monstrous. And you give such attributes as hypocrisy, as hypocrisy comes frequently in characters who are normative religious. All right, in the book, while Shams is presented as a complete andor. Take another scene. A woman dresses up as a man to attend a sermon of Rumi, and there she's a prostitute. And there a former client who is also a guard recognizes her, and he is about to beat her. The public is about to pounce on her for polluting, quote unquote, the space. When who should come in? Shams. Again, it's a man who is doing the rescuing.
Right.
At another place, he calls her when he goes into the red part of the town, all right, he tells the madam who is maintaining the brothel, a hermaphrodite at that. What is the meaning of keeping a hermaphrodite as the keeper of a brothel? It is once again reiterating that Islam is against, any non-marital sex. Because hermaphrodite is a fluid, neither here, neither there. All right, it's sort of, and she is described as most hideous terms. So she is keeping a brothel, all right, and she is told that do not treat Rose badly because she's quote unquote a good girl. Why is she a good girl? Because she has not come into prostitution of her own volition but due to circumstances. Does that mean those who are engaged in sex work voluntarily are bad girls? All right. So the novel elides over those questions. So that is a typical Orientalist fantasy, a
Right.
typical Orientalist idea. So when the East repackaged the same idea, it is re-Orientalism, and it's done by a person who is from the East to cater to the pander to the taste of the bazaar, post-colonial bazaar, because after all, post-colonialism as an academic discipline starts not in the East, but in the colonizer itself. That's one of the greatest ironies. That's where we need to interrogate in my thesis. That is one of the questions I was asking. What are the limits of post-coloniality? We need to understand that.
It's so interesting that you say that if, let's say, I come to Kashmir and I want the same job as you, right? If we both were applying for the assistant professor job.
Mm,
Out here, I feel the way you feel. I'm not white, obviously,
yeah.
right?
Right.
And I'm getting my degree online. And so it's interesting how it just moves, right? You're in the East and you're feeling it there, right? I don't know if you've actually experienced it or not, which is, it doesn't matter, right? Because the idea is still there. But then when my family moved to Los Angeles in the 80s, it
Yeah, they
moved
must
it
have
moved
faced
here.
discrimination too.
Yeah, it's apparent, and it's unfortunate, really. Let's talk about the prevalence of PTSD in Kashmir, and then let's talk about your collection, Green is a Color of Memory, in response to your PTSD.
Well, my PTSD came from, uh, exposure sustained and excessive exposure to death. I grew up in the 90s. I was born in 88. So by the time 90s came, when turmoil started, it was not that Kashmir was peaceful
Mm-hmm.
before the 90s, but armed militancy hadn't yet started. Armed militancy started in 90s in Kashmir, right, when people took up arms against the state.
Yeah.
So it was a particularly traumatic phase, and the first memories of my life are all related to uh, the army, whether it be killing of a neighbor, a roof whose blood-covered shoe was placed on our stairs, uh, whether it be the memory of a man being uh, walked through our lane at gunpoint, whether it be that the neighbor's house was dug up for suspicion of arms, whether it be the frequent crackdowns to which my father had to leave at dawn, and at an end we were never sure whether he would come back or not, or whether it would be the crackdowns in which the army would come in and with their boots and search and frisk everyone and everything, and they had absolute license to do anything and take away anything. Then apart from that, it also affected uh, the people who were around me, who were, say, sort of in their early 20s. All right. So my tutor was in his early 20s, must have been in his early 20s or 16, 17 at best. So what happened when the adults, we were too young to understand what was happening, but when the adults felt powerless before the army, all right, so where did that anger turn towards? That anger was turned towards the child. That anger came out to be taken towards the child. So, for example, my tutor broke my nose. All right, he threw a walnut-made wood desk at my nose, which made my nose bleed like anything. And then there were deaths, a lot of deaths. People, militants died. I have written about it uh, recent. Uh, yeah, I think I wrote about it recently for somewhere. I don't remember where. There were songs, for example, when I would go with my mom to get an injection done. So one of the most painful memories is that of hearing uh, the cassette shop blare the song, "Oh Auto Wala, Rickshaw Wala, have you seen my Bilal? Oh Rickshaw Wala, have you seen my Hilal?" And the auto rickshaw wala would say, "Neither have I seen your Hilal, nor have I seen your Bilal." The implication being that they were kidnapped or arrested by the state and we don't know where they are. Because Hilal Beg was a famous militant at that time. Bilal must have been a militant too. I remember feeling pretty bad because my mom told me that it was the mother of the person who was singing, or the sister of the person asking the auto driver, and I actually imagined it to be some auto driver, which gave me considerable grief. uh, there were similar situations. There were several people who were killed. I myself was then in 2008, 9 and 10, there was curfew in Kashmir all 3 months, 3 years. I was shot at thrice. I was beaten very badly by the CRPF. I saw people being killed, people not being killed, but I saw blood on the road. All right, and I saw a young man's body being trampled by the CRPF. Uh, so, and there were all these memories of people getting injured, people getting beaten up, people getting dying, either by the military or either by the militants. The militants had their fair share of killing too. A neighbor was killed on the suspicion of being an informer. And I was really sad at him being killed because every time I would go to buy milk, I would see him staring by in the window, looking very sad and forlorn. And I felt terrible that he had met such a lonely death. Or there was this dentist whom my mom took me to when I had severe pain in my tooth, one of the first instances of pain I can remember. And I remember he gave me brufen, liquid, which caused me to sort of, which made me burn, which burnt my insides.
Oh man.
All right, and I remember that pain, that sensation very well with that doctor. I don't remember what the doctor looked like, but I remember Brufen as the name of the medicine, a painkiller. And then he was shot dead by the militants. He was a Kashmiri Pandit, a Kashmiri Hindu. All right, and I remember my mom feeling pretty bad, crying over it. So yeah, there were all these memories of seeing burnt houses, of seeing people being killed, beaten. So all these have combined to to give me complex PTSD. And then my dad passed away. My before that, my Masi passed away quite young, both of them in their 40s. Uh, Before that, my cousin passed away at 19. Uh, so there was a lot of death in short. And I was very fascinated by the graveyards, the graveyard poetry. That's why one of the people I loved listening to was Ataullah Khan, Isa Khalvi. Uh, you might know if you are in touch with your Pakistani heritage, you would know
I'm trying.
Ataullah Khan. Yeah, he's actually a legend in Pakistan. He holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the most number of albums produced.
Ooh, that'll be easy to find then.
Yeah,
Write that down. I'll ask
Look
my
him up,
mom.
Ataullah Khan. He's considered a low bro, but he's actually quite close to Imran Khan, who was associated with Tehreek-e-Insaf.
Okay.
And his poetry is pretty macabre. It's about death and heartbreak and loneliness and jail. A mythology has been woven around him that his love married someone else and he murdered the husband and was sentenced to jail, and that's why he wrote his poetry. It's not true, but he actually encouraged the myth because he is not formally trained. Being a Niazi from Niazi tribe, he was actually thrown out from his house for practicing music. So here is an interesting tale. I grew up listening to him. The book came specifically first because the therapist asked me. The therapist said till then I was doing only translations. I didn't write my own poems. I started writing it only in 2010. All
Okay.
right. And most of the early poems are not included at all because they are terrible poems. All right. The beginning of my career, so to speak. The therapist said that rather than repressing these memories, rather than keeping these memories repressed, why don't you try and put them on paper? So, for example, there's a poem, the last poem, called Hysteria, which is about my neighbor Iqbal, who was shot dead when he went out to buy curd. Right? And he was shot in the eye, and a few days later, he died. And the burial is pretty etched in my mind, how we got the body home and buried him. The point being that the therapist said, why don't you try and put these memories on paper? You're already doing translation. Try and do something similar with them. So before I knew what was happening, I just started writing. That was it. And I put them on Facebook, and people, as is the want on Facebook, people liked and this and that. And I thought, okay, perhaps there is some danger of being a poet. Right. So that's how the book came. It's a Facebook product of social media. Right. I posted it on Facebook. People liked. Then I went to Pune, wherein I studied creative writing formally
Mm.
under Professor Randir Khare and Professor Rajrao. And Mukta Samrani to an extent. So that's where I learned the craft actually, and uh, many poems in the book are from that.
Talk more about your resistance poetry. And there's so much to it.
Um, it's
Is
very hard for me to talk about my own poetry. But I'll say this that when I started to write, or when I write,
mm-hmm,
one writes primarily first and foremost for oneself.
mm-hmm,
One doesn't write with an intention to speak for a collective. It so happens that one's experience is so enmeshed in the collective experience. Because what happens here is that we share a common community trauma. And from that community trauma, when there's community trauma forges a kinship, an identity that, prevails over other identities. For example, we are Muslims, we are human beings, we are, Bhat Pandit, whatever, Sunnis or Shias or Ahmadis. But, one thing that we associate always with us is Kashmiri. We are Kashmiri Muslims, all right, to distinguish ourselves from, say, Indian Muslims or Pakistani Muslims, all right. So what happens with community trauma is that one identity, that identity that suffers structural violence, gets foregrounded. So when one writes, naturally one writes from the vantage point of that experience, that identity. So since that identity is irremediably Kashmiri, it so happens that it becomes a counter. It becomes a reflection of the events that have happened. And by compiling those events, by writing those poems, what one hopes to achieve is that to create one's own papers. Because the state writes, enforces its will through papers. The FIR is on paper, the law is on paper, the bureaucrat writes on paper, the public arrest warrant is on paper, the courts function on paper. So the whole legal judiciary mechanism, the police state, police judiciary works on the basis of paper. All right, it's the paper that powers them, basically. So what you try to do is you try to create your own papers. You try to create alternate papers that will, let your identity, it's the last resort of the defeated. There is no point in saying that we are not a defeated people. All right, we cannot match the army on the street. We cannot match India's military strength. All right, there is no point in that. And even if we were to gain independence tomorrow, I can assure you that A, it will fall back into the same chaotic system. B, the price has been very heavy that we have paid. So many people have lost their lives. So many people have lost their eyes, more than lives, the eyesight. So many people have been maimed for life. The price we have paid is far too heavy for anything now to emerge. But what must the defeated do? The defeated cannot just simply accept defeat and resort to, abide by whatever fate will come by. There has to be somewhere wherein we will register our protest and convey what is happening to us. All right, that is the medium of the poetry. And because the state cannot censor poetry, poetry speaks by metaphor. All right, poetry does not speak directly. So you are not liable in a court. Although now in India you can be really imprisoned, even if you are a poet. Varavarara is a prime example of that. All right, but usually metaphors escape the law. All right, because they are not clear. They are
right.
ambiguous in their way. And besides, one also wanted to point out that because the nation state, when the state conceives of space, when the state conceives of the colony, it conceives of it in terms of a single linear narrative. For example, India treats Kashmir as a toot ang. Pakistan's claim is of Shahrag. Both of them are colonizers. Pakistan has a part of Kashmir, India has a part of Kashmir. Okay? Pakistan occupied Kashmir. If there's an IOK, there's also a POK. Anyone arguing for a free Kashmir is not allowed to contest the elections in Pakistan, occupied Kashmir. Alright? So my aim was to, for them it is Kashmir is Shahrak, alright, the jugular vein, alright. So my aim was to point out the aim of resistance literature, resistance poetry is to point out that that we need to move beyond nation spaces. We need to move beyond these spaces of nationality that we have conceived. Because nation states can only be conceived of in terms of a commonality, of a reduced identity that you will have to reduce multiple identities to a single identity. For example, all Kashmiri identities to a Kashmiri identity. Kashmiri Muslim, Kashmiri boy, Kashmiri heterosexual, Kashmiri woman, Kashmiri lesbian, Kashmiri gay, Kashmiri pansexual, whatever. Kashmiris there are. Alright? So whatever Kashmiri Urdu loving people, Kashmiri English loving people, you'll have to reduce all these identities to a single identity of Kashmir because that's how nation states are formed. That's the violence of the nation state. So by adopting metaphor, what the poem wants to show is conflicting energies, conflicting vectors. It wants to show the cleavage. It wants to dramatize the cleavage and contradictions. For example, in one line, there will be two tenses, the present as well as the past. All right. By this disjunction, what I hope to achieve is to show that time is not also conceived of as a single linear space. We do not think of space and time as in terms of a unitary linear way, because that is the way of the colonizer. All right, that is the state's way of disciplining. Poetry is radical and chaotic. Poetry will resist these disciplinary spaces and come out with their excesses spill out. So that is why I believe that resistance poetry must have a metaphoricity of its own. Right? So that is the aim of my poetry, at least. That is the intention. To which extent I have been successful is for the reader to decide, but at least that is what the intention is.
Wonderful. Um, so I want to end with one more poetry reading, but from your first collection.
Sure. I read a poem called At the Cafes of Your Memory,
Okay.
because this is a poem that's quite close to my heart. It starts with a couplet by Faz, आखिर शब के हम सफर, फैज न जाने क्या हुए, रह गई किस जगह सुबह, सुबह किधर रह गई किस जगह सुबह, सुबह किधर किधर गई. Faz, what befell the fellow travelers of late last night? Where did the morning breeze halt? Where did morning alight? Uh, the poem starts at an Avant-Garde cafe in uptown Pune. The reserved tables celebrate a teenager's birthday in cosmopolitan English. Pune is a town in city in Maharashtra of India, a metro. At an Avant-Garde cafe in uptown Pune, the reserved tables celebrate a teenager's birthday in cosmopolitan English. My nearly dead phone flares up with a call from home. My mother laments in frayed Kashmiri. I'm happy you aren't home. Two boys were shot dead today. The waiter sprinkles stale fury over my posh coffee and computes the rushed sum of gun death on pale margins of an old novel once read by my dead father, not a penny less, not a penny more. The waiter sprinkles stale fury over my posh coffee and computes the rushed sum of gun death on pale margins of an old novel once read by my dead father, not a penny less, not a penny more. The ghost of the balloon that blew itself up like an old bomb blast yesterday in the market of my covering poems incites me. Stab the cricket babble, set fire to the uncaring bids of cricketers. It was a time of IPL. Indian Premier League, which is sort of the English Premier League or the baseball in US, wherein players are bid on and they participate in the tournament. Stab the cricket bubble, set fire to the uncaring bids of cricketers, bend the expensive cutlery of showy fashion, and split the pleas table of long-lived puberty. My mother is so grateful I'm safe and alive. I am her world and her afterworld. I must not argue about Kashmir. I must keep safe. She suspects my poems are unsafe and wants them shipped to her without delay. The door of our house is blocked by the tent set up by a time-worn hartal to celebrate the death anniversary of Republic of Tricolor death. The stiff tent will be led to the mazar tomorrow. Brown bamboo bones, packed neatly in coffin white canvas. The courier will then reach me. She drops the dead phone. I rise and pay my overdue bill, shake the birthday boy's surprised hand, smile politely, and wish him a long life ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. And I just want to thank you for joining me today, for talking to me.